Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello and Yali Madat. My name is Zain Noordin, and I have the privilege to serve as a moderator for today's critical conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that seek to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of their land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We do this to express gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living with and caring for their lands for time immemorial. Recognizing them also means acknowledging their historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the ways in which we benefit from and perpetrate violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on is a first step towards making repercussions. I reside in Memphis, Tennessee, and acknowledge that this area is the home of and traditional lands of many Indigenous people, including the Choctaw and Quapaw nations. We believe the work we do in sessions like these is part of our responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm to Indigenous peoples. It is part of our work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Our session today is titled A Living Faith, Understanding the Many Dimensions of Religious Practice. And inshallah, we will explore the role of prayer, sacred spaces, community, and action in the practice of our faith. During this session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions and thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, I am honored to introduce you to our wonderful speakers for today's session. Dr. Shobhana Xavier. Shobhana is an assistant professor of religion and diaspora in the School of Religion at Queen's University. She thinks and writes about Sufism in the United States, Canada, and Sri Lanka. She's the author of Sacred Spaces and Transnational Networks in American Sufism, and a co-author of Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture. Her new book, Dervishes of the North, Rumi, Whirling, and the Making of Sufism in Canada, is set to be out for May 2023. She has also been working on a long-term project on Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka and the growing anti-Muslim violence and anti-Sufism. Finally, she is a co-host of the podcast series New Books in Islamic Studies. Our second speaker, Rizwan Mawani, has a background in anthropology and religious studies with degrees from Clayton University in Canada and the Graduate Theological Union in the United States. His research focuses on Muslim diversity, pluralism, with specific reference to spaces of worship, ritual practice, and forms of religious authority. Rizwan has conducted field research with more than 50 Muslim communities across 17 countries and numerous cultures from Senegal and Iran to China and Indonesia. His research spans the range of Muslim identities from Sunni and Shia Muslim to Sufi and mystically inclined communities that transcend traditional theological divides. Some of his research is included in his book, Beyond the Mosque, Diverse Spaces of Worship, as well as in encyclopedia and academic articles. Rizwan has also been involved in studying the history and development of the Ismaili and related communities in the 19th and 20th century under the leadership of the first three Aga Khans. As part of that research, he has also focused on the Ismaili Jamaat Khana, particularly in South Asia and East Africa over the last 2 centuries, exploring the ways in which Ismaili identity asserted itself in social and religious forms during this period. Before we get started, I would like to note that views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. With that, let's turn to our conversation. So Rizwan, Shobhana, thank you so much for joining us today. It is truly an honor to have you here and be part of this conversation. And as we begin, we note that both of you have researched and written extensively about the role of sacred spaces. Shobhana, can you maybe share more about your research about particular Sufi shrines and the westernization of certain Sufis and Sufi orders?
Thanks so much, Zain, for the generous introduction. And I'm really happy to be with you all here to just be in conversation. And especially you, Rizwan, it's a pleasure to meet you and connect with you. I'm just going to quickly share a couple of pictures just to give you a sense of visuals of some of the spaces that I work with. Zain, I just want to make sure that you could see.
Yes.
Great. I guess in terms of my research, one of the things I'm really interested in are Sufi spaces, and particularly in the South Asian context and also in the North American context. So this is, for instance, a shrine to Nizamuddin Auliya in New Delhi. And this is a 14th century Sufi teacher who is entombed. And so there's a lot of kind of celebration and gathering that takes place. And so when I go to these spaces, I often think about, who are the people who are gathered there? What are those people doing? And how are they gathering, and who's allowed into certain parts of the spaces and who's not. So for instance, in this one, the main sanctuary area, which is past the gates at the front, women are not allowed to enter into those spaces, right? So Sufi spaces, which are really around stories of these holy figures, sometimes are spaces that are radical and subversive, especially around gender and, religious identities as well. So Muslims and non-Muslims who participate and share in those spaces. And so because of that, I really kind of look at these spaces and think about them as text. And I spend a lot of my time in these different spaces around the world. This is one that's close by, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and has a different kind of vibe as well, right? And by vibe, I mean that perhaps it's a little bit more, less icons, like less rose petals, less kind of folks gathering around. And so I take all of this into account, and I really just think about what it tells about the ways we think about Islam and Sufism, and how some of these practices of Sufi shrines are showing up in the American context, right? So this is a shrine in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, with a Sufi teacher named Baba Muhyiddin, who was from Sri Lanka and was buried there 1986, and a huge kind of community and following has formed around him. People come to do pilgrimages, right? And so when I look at these spaces, I'm really interested in really more about the stories of the people who come here, who identify themselves as Muslims, and what they're doing in the process and what they hope to do, take away from the experience of being there. And these are individuals who are Sufis, and some of them are Muslims, some of them are not, some of them are immigrants, some of them are not. And so I think spaces for me are really just a wonderful tool that highlights and illuminates diversity of Muslim practices and diverse stories. And so it's a reason why I tend to gravitate towards them, because I really want to tell the stories of the people who show up there and how they feel and what they believe their relationship to that space is. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction. And of course, I could say more throughout our conversation.
Thank you so much, Shobhana. Rizwan, so turning to you, with your work and experience, could you share a little bit more about the diversity of sacred spaces that you've seen in Islam and around the world?
Yeah, I mean, Shobhana, thank you for that. That was fantastic, especially the visuals. And I think for many people, they think of Sufism as something that belongs to an Islam that's outside of North America. So I really appreciate sort of you sharing some of that with you. And as I've been traveling around the world, I've also realized that space, just like you, is a conduit for telling the lives of Muslims and what it means to be Muslim and how different people from around the world are understanding their Islam, their Muslim identity through the practices they have, through the spaces they frequent and pray at. And one of the things that I've realized, just like you, is culture plays a massive role in that happening. And so what Sufism, what we umbrella calls Sufism in the context of Sri Lanka is very different from what Sufism looks like in China, or what Sufism looks like in Senegal. And, as I've been sort of traveling, one of the things that I began to do was to really document the kinds of spaces that Muslims were frequenting for their practice. There's a tendency, especially, of course, among Sunni Muslims, because the mosque is the primary space for worship, to think the mosque is the only space for worship. But I think as we travel around the world, we see lots of different other ways in which Muslims express their piety through different sorts of spaces. So the dargah, or the shrine, is one of those spaces. And we see that in Sufism, we see that in Shiism, we see that in Sunnism, and we see that in communities who define themselves outside of those boundaries. In addition to that, of course, the majority of the audience here is Ismaili, and we know the Jamaat Khana is another focal point of Muslim practice. And as I began to document these spaces, what I thought initially was going to be 4 or 5 or 6 kinds of space types ended up being 20, 25, 30, some very local, belonging to regions and countries, some kind of translocal, belonging to various regions or linguistic groups, and some which were sort of much more global in nature, like the mosque or the masjid. What I also began to realize is that what one group calls the masjid in one community or in one country may be very, very different from what a masjid feels like, looks like, what kind of rituals take place within those spaces for another group or another community. So I think, just like Shobhana, one of the things that I began to realize, and I began as a learner, as I was traveling from place to place and region to region and meeting Muslims of all persuasions and backgrounds, is that Islam really meant different things to different people. And the space in which they frequented or prayed at or engaged with was really sort of an entry point into learning about what they thought about. So when we see a space of worship, a mosque, for example, or a Jamaat Khana from the outside, we see the architecture of the space. But that architecture doesn't really tell us much about that space. It might tell us a little bit about who the patron of that space was, whether it's a modest space or whether it's a sort of a landmark space. But it doesn't really tell us much about the people who frequent it. And we often know that when something gets built, there is an intent for that space. But oftentimes the people and the culture they develop in that space that tells us more about that space and how it operates, and the community that sort of that space has also created, and that in turn recreates that space in a different sort of way as well. And so, one of the things that I really learned is that, and I found this when I was writing my book, and as I continue to write, is that almost every line I write that is an essential line, Muslims believe that I have to revisit, because I can think of an exception for every single case. And so for me to be true to the communities that I research and look at, I have to make sure that I incorporate their stories. And I think, just like Shobhana is trying to do with her research, is we want to ensure that Muslims who traditionally may not have had a voice, or who may have been sort of captured in the voices of others, somehow find a space to articulate who they are. And space becomes a great way by which to do so.
Wow, Rizwan, that's great. And thank you so much for, kind of providing a lot more color on different sacred spaces. But so could you maybe either if you talk a little bit more about what makes up a sacred space in Islam, right? Like from beliefs, traditions, cultures, just kind of based on your research and background. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I could start. I think that's a great question, because I think, so much of what makes up a space or a ritual is like really bounded by the stories we tell, right? And so I think that's what's really fabulous about looking at a physical space, and why I love talking to people who come to that space is like, actually, what story brought you here, right? The story in Coatesville, Pennsylvania is a story of a Sufi teacher that came to America in 1971 who died. There's a lot of miracles associated with him, right? So people come with their grief, people come with their pain, people come from all these things. And And what was really interesting is that the space in Coatesville that I showed you, that's like the white building, which is in farm country and, an Amish farm country, a lot of that was built by Americans, right? Those who came from Jewish and Christian backgrounds who were really interested in spirituality in the 1970s and 1980s. And they kind of just thought that they were building something for their teacher. They really wanted to honor their teacher and memorialize. And we have a tendency to want to memorialize people that have gone from this realm, right? And we want to maybe keep pictures of them around us or something like that. So at a very basic level, you could think of, these spaces as memorial spaces, and that really just means like sites of memories. This is a space in which there's a memory that's attached to it here, a person's memory. And when we come to this space, we like remember that memory. And that memory ultimately from a Sufi perspective that's tied to Islam is that it's a memory that goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, that goes back to Allah, right? So there's like a lineage of memory too. So it's not just singularly in one moment in time, but it's across space, across time, right? So it's almost very cosmic. But what's also fascinating about what happened in Pennsylvania with the Sufi shrine is that even though folks who identified as Americans were probably racially quite predominantly, many of them were white, but not all of them, right? Some Black Muslims, some Iranians, right? In the 1990s and into the 2000s, word kind of got out that there was a space in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and word got out really in the Eastern Seaboard, like New Jersey. And so for South Asians, let's say, particularly Pakistanis, they kind of had a particular idea what the space meant for them, but they knew what the space meant for them back home. So here are people, Muslims in a new country, feeling really dislocated, trying to figure out community. They do have community, and they go to masjids, they have their, their storefronts, their grocery stores. Like, we can't, disregard these spaces of familiarity and home across many ways, right? Food, a family, all of this. But there was like this one element of a Sufi shrine being like another space that really reminded them of home. And so, they slowly start driving from New Jersey to Coatesville, Pennsylvania, passing by the Amish, passing by the Mennonites. And here they are in the middle of kind of rolling hills, farm country, and they see a space, and all of a sudden they feel like, oh, this feels like home. So what is that about, right? So here there's like multiple stories, and this is what I love. There's multiple stories that are being layered on this one space. And so when they come to it, they're bringing that with them, right? And many people used to say, when I walked into this mazar in Fort Bawa, I felt like I was home. And many of these were immigrant Muslims, first generation immigrant Muslims, right? They would bring their food, they would bring roses and, all of this stuff. They want to picnic out. So it's really interesting to think about how maybe just a generation ago, not even a decade ago, a lot of the immediate students of Bawa Muhyiddin, this Sri Lankan Sufi teacher, they built it because they just wanted to have a site of memory that they could connect with their teacher. They never thought they were building something that 10 years later, these immigrants are going to show up and feel like this is their memory that they're adding on to it, right? So I think spaces, for me, one of the things, it's not the only thing, but one of the things I think about it is like, it's a site of memory, and it's helping us get somewhere because it's so physical, it's tangible. And so the question then becomes like, what is that place that it's getting people to? What memory is it helping them remember or recollect? And how is that tied to spiritual practices, religious practices, to Islam, right? And maybe for some people, not Islam, right? Some of these places, especially in South Asia, for instance, Hindus and Sikhs and, everybody are showing up, right? And so like, what does it mean that people across different religious traditions can show up and add memory to a space and add stories to a space in some way, right? I don't know, Rizwan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you maybe think about a lot of things. And I think in addition to memory, which I think is a fantastic way to think about space, is this larger idea also of meaning. What gives me a sense of meaning in this world? I think for me, as I think about how spaces develop, how spaces transform over time, what gives a space that sacredness is the ability for it to have meaning in my life. Whether that means whether it's in my home and I just have images that remind me of my religion, my practice, what anchors me in my life, I think is really important. And I think when we look at communal spaces, things like mazars and durgas and masjids and jamaat khanas, it's also about meaning and community, because it's oftentimes the community negotiates and understands meaning in different sorts of ways. And so that space oftentimes provides a site, just like it does for memory, it also provides a site for that sense of meaning. And I think that's something that's really, really important. And it's also, meaning is also about comfort. It's about what makes sense of things. And, I think the Ismaili story is very similar in many ways. When Ismailis first started traveling to the United States and to Canada and to Europe and other parts of the world, from places where they once traditionally lived, the Jamaat Khana was actually a meeting place. It was a place where people would come together and obviously gather together to pray, but it was so much more. It was a site of connection. It was a site of talking about the homeland. It was a site of having conversations about, learning about the new country that they were in. And so meaning meant not just religious meaning, it also meant meaning of a sense of how do I locate myself in this new environment? What does it mean? And so I think there's both a sense of kind of an imagined sense of memory, because that the space that they remember and imagine may be very, very different in the political climate or the cultural climate from when they left. But it's a way of kind of reliving that environment in that space. And then also setting yourself up for the now and the future to say, now, what does this mean for me in the present moment? So one of the things I'm guessing that you may have seen in your research is that, of course, there is an attempt to try and translocate or move something from its imagined space to its sort of space in this new environment. But there's also changes that happen organically or maybe not organically in that space. And so I think for me, the sacred, isn't always just about the kind of the divine, but it's about the meaning that's created by the people who use that space, whether it's an individual in a family home or whether it's a group of people in an environment. And I think at different times of the day, at different times of the year, when there are festivals, for example, that meaning changes and different people often use the space in different kinds of ways. And so for me, the sacred encapsulates all of that.
Wow. Thank you so much. And as you were talking, it just kind of made me reflect about like just even my Jamaat kind of here in Memphis, right? And like all the different ways we use that space for just different Jamaati programs, as well as obviously for prayers. But it was zooming out, I also thought a lot about the Smiley Center in Houston, and like how will we be talking about that in 50 or 100 years? So just a lot of great thought-provoking discussion here. Just a lot of sacred spaces is built around like community coming together and physically attending that space. But the pandemic was this unique time where we weren't going to these sacred spaces, right? So how has the pandemic kind of just generally impacted the way faith communities engage with sacred spaces?
Okay, I don't know. Going first, yeah, Rizwan. So if you ever want to go first, please let me know. I think one of the things that's really fascinating is that I think here we have become perhaps in some ways, and I think this is true of most religious traditions. I don't think this is like really particular to just Islam in any way. I think most religious traditions have a particular attachment or relationship or sense of meaning that space provides. And so I think the pandemic was really fascinating. I mean, despite the crisis and kind of the ways in which it really harmed a lot of communities, it's interesting to think about like what the lack of going to specific the inability, being not able to go to a space, what it did to people, like the isolation process of it. And one example I often use, partly because I had experienced this with my family, is we have a tendency to gather when people die. We tend to gather together in community spaces, sacred spaces, and then you start realizing, oh, certain religious traditions have certain approaches to how we grieve and how we, get people sent off to the next world or whatever relationships are. So it's really fascinating for me to pay attention to the fact that during the process of what would have been a religious funeral, so many people were isolated in their homes and not able to come together, to grieve together, to do these kind of rituals and things like that. And I often tell my students to think about religion as kind of serving a function. It serves a purpose. It's actually really practical. I don't think we need to always dwell in the realm of these bigger questions, even though that's there. I think from a day-to-day basis, we can kind of say religion works for people because it does things for people. It helps people. And like grieving the dead is a really good example of that. Right, because we all need different modes and ways and to do that. And so perhaps coming together in a community space to grieve those who have passed is really important. And so not being able to do that in the pandemic because we couldn't come together. And what did it mean for us to go to a funeral on Zoom? Like, did it have the same impact? Because maybe we were gathering for weekly prayers, or like, I know a lot of Sufi communities, one of the main rituals that happens is zikr, so the remembrance, right? And so a lot of zikr events were being held on Zoom, right? And did it have the same vibe? Like, were you getting the same process and experience? And if you don't, like, is ultimately our faith practices, religious practices, is that something that should be confined to space, or is it something that should transcend space and time? So then you start getting into these really bigger religious questions, and if you're a practitioner of different religious traditions, you might ask these questions about like, oh, like, actually, is me praying in this way really confined to the fact that I need to be in this space to pray? Or what does it mean to be at home by myself or logging on Zoom? Am I getting the same juice? Like, am I getting the same spiritual energy? Like, is that happening? Or if not, like, then what is that about? Have I not, actualized myself enough in some capacity? Isn't religion something supposed to ultimately be internal, interior, private, contemplative? So I think the pandemic and kind of the dissonance and the disruptions it brought, particularly in terms of the ability to gather, really raised a lot of questions of why do we do the things that we do, and what are the things that are really meaningful? Is it the people, as Rizwan says, like, are we going to these spaces to connect with people? If we show up to the space and the space is completely empty and we still do the ritual, are we still getting the thing that we want? And why is it different for me to sit at home and maybe have the practice or read that, read a particular passage from a sacred text, and am I not getting the same experience? Right. So really kind of fundamentally ask, like, what constitutes ritual? What constitutes sacred space? What constitutes community?
Awesome. Thanks. Rizwan, yeah, love to hear your perspective on this.
I think, Shobhana, I think you're right. I think, an easy way or a simple way to think about rituals, and of course, there's lots of ways to think about ritual in space, is this idea of having a function. And I think, I think of the experience of the Ismaili community and other religious communities as well, right throughout the world, who are, of course, negatively affected by the pandemic, is that I think people, it's interesting because I think people realize two things. Number one is that space is really a conduit for, or a place that sanctions ritual. And when the space was not available, those rituals oftentimes weren't available, at least not those rituals, not in the context of the community. And I think you're right that many people struggled in the early phases of what potentially could be sanctioned online, especially for communities that may have private practices or practices that are generally confined to the spaces in which they use. And so if they were reciting a particular zikr or weird that was only available to that community, for example, or they were, reciting particular formulas or had particular litanies, for example, those may not have easily been available at the beginning. I think secondly, when ritual is mediated by technology or ritual is not happening in the context of a community, you're right, there is something that feels different about that ritual. And I think some people were able to make peace with sort of doing it in this way because they had access to the ritual practice, and others were like, this doesn't feel the same way. In the same way that I think when people began returning to their spaces, when they were mediated by masks, when there was, things that were sort of altered to accommodate health regulations in particular jurisdictions and environments, people felt that this felt somehow, that kind of spark, that ingenuity, that kind of the thing that happens in the context of ritual that you can't really explain, is somehow lost in that process because it doesn't take the same form. And that form, people, I think, were realizing had value to it. And so I think the challenge is that people were, I think, struggling with a lot of those sorts of things. I think the other thing that the challenge is that space brought out, or lack of access to space brought out a lot of inequities that were already there that we didn't know about. And so, who then needs access to that space? So, people, for example, who live in a community where a masjid or a jamaat khana or a shrine is really, really important to their lifestyle or to the routine of their day. I know in the Ismaili community, many elders really look forward to coming to the jamaat khana, and it's an important part of their day. They plan for it psychologically, physically. And so not having access to that space meant loneliness. It meant not having access to social bonds of community. It meant maybe not having access to food, which they may have been provided to them in a particular space, for example. So I think those things are challenging for individuals. And so the pandemic, I think, raised a lot of concerns, but I think also some people may have realized they may not need space in the same kind of way. And I think that's a valid realization for a lot of people too. I think we think of space, and you and I in the research that we do, of course, think of space as a a physical architectural manifestation. But I think there's a sense of inner space that many people have found or have created, or who may not have access to the kind of spaces that we're talking about, find within themselves. And so, can we begin to talk about an inner masjid or an inner Jamaat Khana or an inner Durga or an inner Zawiya Khanaka that encapsulates that space in different kinds of ways? Because if ritual itself is something that's embodied, we do with our body, is it possible then to interiorize that space in a different sort of way as well? And to think about it in different sorts of, I don't know, different sorts of ways. I don't know, Shobhana, I don't know what you think about sort of thinking about space in that kind of a way.
Yeah, and I think I think I have two thoughts coming. The first thought is kind of the idea that Sufis often think that the physical is not the thing that we need to get attached to, right? Like, the real universe is a universe within, the real, place of connection to Allah is the heart within. These are not things that have to be external and should be. And in fact, the externals are just tools or stepping stones for us to get to the place of no space and get to that, place of no time, right? And so all of the things ultimately from a Sufi teaching, they might say is within you. And so, but we're not perfect beings, right? Why do we need to have pictures of our teachers around us? Or why do we need to have tasbihs in our hands? Like, why do we need these things? These are tools for us to help us because we are trying to perfect our practice. And so ultimately the goal would be, what would it mean for you to be be at home by yourself and, kind of tapping into the space of the mazar, tapping into the space of, the Jamaat Khana, right? So, and I think I love the way that you put it, like, what is the Jamaat Khana within your heart? What is the mazar of your heart? Those are states of being as opposed to places of being, right? And I think that it's the states that most spiritual teachers and Shi traditions, Sufi traditions, across Islam are trying to teach us to be like, go within as opposed to being attached to the form. But sometimes we need the form because we're not perfect, right? Yeah. And the other thing that I'm really struck by is this question of accessibility. I think what's interesting is that, so much of us who are able-bodied, our privilege and all the identities that we have, sometimes never think twice about walking into certain spaces and being like, am I going to be welcomed? Is somebody going to judge me? Is somebody going to question my presence here? And then I think what's has happened is that the online accessibility all of a sudden gave space, and availability to people who couldn't physically go into a space, right? Many of you are gathered in the space and you don't have to turn on your cameras or you don't have to do anything, and you could still access information. You could still be part of the ritual. And if if you're somebody whose identities are marginalized and people don't see you as human, walking into a space, and in most spaces, some spaces are gendered, like I talked about in terms of the mazar. And if your identities are diverse and beautiful and does not fit the norm, and you have to make these decisions about what to wear, where to go sit, am I allowed to go in or not? And then all of a sudden you want to be part of the community, but you feel that maybe the community does not want you or see your humanity. But perhaps there's, perhaps you could tap into something because all of a sudden things, because of technology, we went on Zoom and you found your people, right? And so I think it's also important to think about, rituals, sacred spaces, religious traditions change and transform over time. It's never permanent. And so when we start thinking about these like global events or think about even ourselves as human beings, our needs change in different points in our lives, and we tap into certain things based on kind of where we're at in our lives, right? Sometimes we're a little bit religious, other times we just forget about God and you're like, oh, things are great, and then something goes wrong and you're like, oh, I need to maybe say some prayers, right? And so if we think about it in that way, but we also think about the fact that socially, politically, climate wise, with the environment chaos, so many things are going to change, right? And so it's going to impact the ways that we do things. And I think for communities and for human beings, it's going to impact the ways that we can access certain things as well. So accessibility is important. And I think as much as Zoom perhaps was hard for some people, especially the elders in our community who really relied on going to the morning prayers, or you know what I mean? And like the sense of seeing their buddies at these spaces, really adorable. For others, they may not have had that relationship to the space, but because it was on Zoom and because they could be protected and safe in their own homes, they could still hear the prayers, or they could participate in zikr and feel like, okay, this is something I don't have access to, but all of a sudden can have access to and still be safe as a human being.
I really like that, Shobhana, and I think there's two things that I want to maybe piggyback on, if that's okay, in terms of what you said. So the first is this whole idea of maybe the kind of material culture, the kind of objects that we have that are important to us, and the portability of religion and ritual. So, we tend to think, of course, of spaces, these grand spaces, obviously place that we can kind of, there's a roof over our heads. But I think you reminded me that even much, obviously much more before the pandemic and for time immemorial, we've all kind of had these sort of quote unquote reminders or things that we have with us that facilitate religious practice. So whether it's the tasbih or the masbah, whether it's a photograph or a picture of a Sufi peer, sheikh, a Shi'i imam, for example, someone that helps us connect to the divine. I think those are great because those are portable. We've always had those. And even though we haven't been able to oftentimes do it in the sense of community, it allows us to sort of remind ourselves that religion is transportable. It's not something that has to happen in a home or in a sacred space. It can happen wherever we are, whether we're reciting sort of a zikr on a bus, or whether we're, thinking about sort of the divine in our beds in the morning, for example, when we wake up. I think there's lots of ways that we can think about religion within and outside of space. And I think that's really, really interesting to think about too, is that are there objects in our lives that, whether formal, that are sort of prescribed by sort of religious culture, or that are part of our family or communal inheritances, or are there objects that are meaningful to us personally that make sense? And one of the things that I was thinking of, because I know you shared the picture of some of the Chishti durgas at the beginning. These were the, some of the durgas that belong to that particular lineage of Sufis in South Asia. Was the practice that I saw when I went there, which was this sort of almost outsourcing of prayer. The idea that you could kind of provide an offering, and you'd have these group of people sitting in a circle. And I remember seeing them with coffee beans, and they would be reciting, let's say 1100 or, a very, very large number of repetitious prayers. And then they would use that as a counting device, because there's no tasbih that's big enough for 1100 sort of beads. But it was this idea that prayer could also kind of, it was part of something that was shared, but that could also kind of be outsourced, that you had the ability for other people praying for you on your behalf. And so, I think the example you also brought up of funerary rituals is interesting, because it's the one time where we kind of come together and collectively pray in a different sort of way. I feel like in the context of the masjid or the Jamaat Khana, obviously yourself is at the center of that prayer. When someone passes away, your prayers are obviously still directed towards that way and towards Allah, but there's also sort of a reckoning of that direction towards the deceased and memorializing, remembering the deceased, having those memories. And so there's lots of, I think, really interesting things that were in fact impacted by the pandemic. And I love the idea that you brought up of technology also being a liberating force. While it was difficult for many to get used to technology or ritual through technology, I think for people who have found it difficult to connect with their community because of their identity, because of the way they dress, because of the way they present themselves, because of the ways in which community is defined in particular groups, I think you're right. Technology potentially allowed them to be themselves in a way that they haven't been able to, and participate in the way they haven't to before. And I think this is one of the struggles, with the sense of community, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual identity, whether it's race, all of those things play a role in the ways in which groups define who is them and who the outsider is. And I really loved how you talked about sort of not, this idea of not recognizing the humanity, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. We're not recognizing the humanity that a person brings to the table. And that relationship that they have with their creator is then somehow severed by a community not giving them access, which is very, very unfortunate, at least not formally in the space that they provide. And so I think, we tend to think of spaces as vehicles for engendering community, but I think you're absolutely right. And of course, these are culturally contingent, but spaces also have the potential to sever community or to define community in different sorts of ways. So I know when I've traveled around the world, some countries don't even allow non-Muslims in masjids. Other countries do. There are a handful of countries that don't, where masjids aren't spaces for women at all. Women aren't even allowed to enter those spaces. So at least half of the population can't even enter a space of worship for many Muslims. And then there are other environments where, because, for example, of rules like in communist or post-communist regimes, China, Tajikistan, I can think of others, where people under a certain age aren't allowed within spaces of worship, whether that's a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a jamaat khana, etc. And so oftentimes there are, spaces can also be sites of exclusion, and people have to find ways to negotiate or navigate those sorts of things as well. And so those are obviously challenges that come across long before the pandemic. And so people, I think, struggle then with trying to figure out ways to manage those. And I don't know if you've seen examples of change in the research that you've done where there's been successful attempts at finding spaces for people who are marginalized, for groups finding other ways to connect to their religious identity. I don't know if you've seen that with younger people that you've worked with as well in terms of the spaces that you're familiar with.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're noting, especially in the American context, are women-led, masjids, right? We have, there's one in Toronto, doesn't have a permanent space, but it's like a rotating space, LA. And I think a lot of the times we have this really unfortunate narrative that we think that these spaces are emerging because they're Western and modern, but women-only mosques have existed historically, for ages, for years, in China, all over the world. I think Mauritius, there's one great book that was out that looked at these spaces across historical times. So I think when we do talk about these spaces, I'm always very careful to make sure that we're not essentializing that it's because of Westernization, these spaces are emerging and liberating women. No, that's obviously a very problematic thing to say, particularly in the ways that Muslim women are portrayed in mainstream media as like one-dimensional human beings with no agency, if they're even portrayed as human beings half the time. And so, yeah, these spaces are emerging. Unfortunately, they're not, normative spaces. They're still perceived as spaces on the margins. And I think even, scholars, like the people that I engage with the most, may not even perceive them as legitimate spaces, right? They have particular ideas about what this should look like. But I think the day-to-day practices and that's kind of the spaces that I show up at too, it's interesting, right? In terms of like what people are wanting, especially the young people, where they want to go and cultivate these spaces and where they're building community. And I think social media, again, has been really important in making those connections, because historically we might have been really siloed and felt really alone and not able to find community. But now people are finding those communities and realizing, we could build, like we can maybe continue to exist virtually and show up for each other on WhatsApp and all of these things. But let's meet, let's pray together. And a lot of these really important organizations are really conscious about folks who are incarcerated, really conscious about accessibility in terms of differently abled bodies, right? And again, a lot of this consciousness is coming from their understanding of the Quran. If we are truly to be inclusive in the essence of what Allah has taught, their perception of Islam, then then how do you practice that, And so I think those are the spaces that are really fascinating, and many people are really gravitating towards us, right? And so what does it mean for us then to think about spaces, of the next few generations, and how these spaces are going to be mediated, whose stories are going to be at the forefront. And those are the stories that I really love talking about too, right? Because I don't think like Black studies scholars and Indigenous studies scholars often say, it's important, and I think about this a lot because I come from a context of war in Sri Lanka, is that, we often dwell in the sense of resiliency and these communities, suffering and all of this stuff, and like we've trauma of wars and stuff like that. But in, Indigenous studies scholars and Black studies scholars teach that, if we only dwell in the space of suffering and we only dwell in the space of marginality, then we're also perpetuating those ideals and stories within ourselves. So, what are the stories of inclusion and what are the stories of hard work that people are building around love and community? And we should also tell those stories, because then people will think that only, Islamophobia is the only thing we could talk about for Muslims. And then we're not talking about the fact that they're loving and, they're building community, and then they're laughing and they're doing really fun things, right? And so I think this is why it's really important in some of the stories I tell about Sufism is to tell those stories, right? And it could be space dependent, it could be object dependent, it could be community dependent, but it doesn't have to be those things either. Yeah.
Thanks, Shobhana. I think in addition to obviously being historical examples of women-only mosques, whether you brought a number of them up, and of course there are many more. I think one of the things I've also realized, when I started to begin to also look at sort of the various identities that Muslims had, in addition to just male and femaleness, there was also identities that existed in the pre-modern world, even though we maybe labeled them as differently. But there was eunuchs, for example, who were, castrated males living in particular environments. And these were groups of people in some cases that were patronized by certain empires like the Ottomans. You know, in Oman, you had this class of person known as the Muhannad, who was this kind of effeminate male. In Pakistan today, you've only recently given rights for hijras, this sort of middle class of individuals who don't neatly fit within the category of male or female. And you have now hijra only masjids, for example, that exist in Pakistan. And so I think, you know, we tend to label gender in a particular way because we think we're at a particular moment in our history, but we know people who have identified as Muslim and had diverse gender identities exist throughout history. And of course, they wouldn't have been completely severed from religious practice and religious prayer. So while we don't know a lot about what religious practice may have looked like for them, we know that they were included as part of the larger Muslim Ummah. And so, you know, we have examples of this, I think, historically as well, to think about that. And I love this idea of love that you brought up, because I think ultimately, when we talk about Sufism, when we talk about Shiism, when we talk about other groups of Muslims as well, Sunnis included, you know, I think love is at the heart of religious practice for many, many Muslims. And I think that individual relationship that individual Muslims have with their creator is oftentimes bound, predicated on this sense of love. And oftentimes space is also built on love. I love, one of the reasons I love sort of stories of diaspora is we've also oftentimes rescued and kept the stories that were involved in the creation of space. And oftentimes those stories are stories of love. They're about honoring a particular master. They're about trying to find a space of practice in a new environment that is foreign to somebody else. They're about, you know, finding connection between people. And those are ultimately stories of love. And so, you know, we talk about spaces oftentimes and their use and their practice, but I think sometimes talking about sort of the stories of creation, at least the way they're memorialized and remembered, even though their origins may be somewhat different, often have strong tinges of love as well. And, you know, when we talk about also this idea of the margins, I think we can also talk about theological margins, sort of what is considered a Muslim sacred space and who belongs to that sense. And, you know, I know in the North American encounter, if we look at even right up till the 1930s, I know in Canada, some of the earliest Muslim spaces were spaces of the Druze Muslim community in Alberta. As migrants moved from Lebanon and Syria and places like that at the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of the First World War. But these are not necessarily documented. You know, so in Canada, I know the story we tell ourselves about the beginning of the first Muslim communities often goes back to the Al Rashid Mosque in Edmonton, because this is the first mosque that we considered sort of a Muslim space. The same is true in the United States, and there's oftentimes debates as to what constitutes the first Muslim space. But I think we forget that there were Muslims of all proclivities and implications that may not have been considered Muslim by traditional definitions at this point or junction in history. And I think if we think of religious practice in those sorts of ways too, whether it's this small zawiya or a small Hanukkah, for example, in someone's home, you know, those have resonances too. And durgahs, you know, when many people think of Sufism in the United States, the durgah or the mazar is not something they think of, because Sufism is not homegrown in the United States in the same kind of way. And so I think it's important to think about the margins also as helping us to shed light on what the community is and has become. And race is the same way. We know the Ahmadiyya community, the Nation of Islam, were integral in the United States in bringing Islam to America. And it was only later that they were really considered sort of much more on the margins of what the Muslim community was. But without them, you wouldn't have seen sort of the growth of the early Muslim community at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States. And these would have been obviously people who came from different backgrounds, Pakistanis with the Ahmadis, oftentimes Black Muslims with the Nation of Islam. And so you have sort of different stories. And so the irony is that today, what is often considered the margins were the center in the early 20th century. And this is what brought Islam to many of these places. But of course, as power relationships have shifted, as global economics and global power sort of imbalances have emerged, we begin to see different senses of what the center is or what is considered Muslim and what is not considered Muslim. And of course, what religious practices belong to that as well.
I just wanted to quickly share another image, if I could get it to work. Let's see. One of the things I often talk about when I talk about Sufism in America is a story of Black Muslims, right? Enslaved Muslims who were brought from West Africa. And I think we have a tendency to say that we are talking about, you could see the slide of Omar ibn Said? Yeah, of early enslaved folks. And Omar ibn Said is a great example, is that we know much about him because there's an autobiography behind that he left behind, and a book about him is coming out in August, co-authored with Carl Ernst, right? And it's, what is it? I think one of the things I think I'm hearing Rizwan you say is also you're cautioning us not also to get attached to the idea of space as the only way in which we tell stories. Because if we think about, the first Muslims who ever made it to North America before United States or Canada existed as these nation states and nation projects, are individuals who weren't seen as human beings, and they were deeply Muslim, but their sense of piety and practices were so internalized for their own safety and survival, right? They may have outwardly converted to Christianity because that's what they had to do, right? And Omar ibn Said is a great example because he wrote in Arabic. He left these autobiographical notes. He makes references to Sufism and Sufi theological traditions, right? He's citing these scholars like Ibn al-Arabi, who's a huge thinker, and referencing practices of zikr, right? And we have no spaces left, even objects left of these human beings, right? We have these little bits of archives in which we have to start thinking about how, we have to imagine the lives of these individuals and the stories and the ways in which they lived in America during the time in which America did not recognize their humanity in any one way. And I think as individuals who are thinking about, as academics or as individuals who are thinking about this from inside the community, we have to realize that, when you stand in these places, these are the stories that we also have to remember, right? Because then when we don't tell these stories and we're marginalizing and continuing to erase people's voices, right? And this is as important as stories of individuals with diverse gender identities or sexual identities, right? This is also thinking about what it meant to have been someone who came from West Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean. Many people died on that journey, were sold into slavery. And yet in the midst of it, in the midst of servitude, they have continued to practice their Islam. And some of this was practiced through food practices, right? And so there's stories and stories of, certain things that, people in subsequent generations talk about. My great-great-grandmother made this food item, but she would only do it on Friday. And we don't know why she made it on Friday, but this is what we ate on Friday, right? And so it's interesting that some of these things have come across generations, and we have to reference back and be like, oh, this is why. So maybe there wasn't space, maybe there wasn't community, maybe they couldn't do, Juma prayers, but there was something else that they did, right? Working in the fields, maybe they were remembering the names of Allah, the Asma al-Husna, and practicing zikr. And how was that an interior practice as well? And how was that also an act of rebellion, right? And complete survival in the midst of complete devastation and horror and violence to these individuals as well. And so remembering these stories and the ways in which piety is sustained in these moments is really, really important, and helps us remember that sure, spaces are important, objects are important, but religion and the survival, the continuity of religion is not dependent on them all the time, because when these things are taken away, you find that somehow religion continues to persist, right? And what is that about as well, right? I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shobhana and Rizwan. Sorry, Rizwan, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, you've also made me think, Shobhana, of the ways in which we think for those who only know Islam in a North American context, of how we think of Islam abroad. And, the story of Omar ibn Said is a perfect example of how we're rethinking about what the first Muslims in America look like, or what practices look like, or where they came from. And I think, for much of the last century, Islam in America has been thought of sort of as an Arab Islam in many ways, now inflected obviously with South Asian and others. But when I think about how we think about the Muslim world, and I do this in a lot of the talks that I give, is help people to reconceptualize thinking about the Muslim world, not just as Shia or Sunni, or helping them think about Sufism as not sort of necessarily belonging to one of those proclivities, but sort of transcending them in different ways. But, Omar ibn Said, and thinking about West Africa, most people, when they think of blocks of religious identity in the Muslim world, they may think of Shiism in Iran, or they might think of Wahhabi Islam in Saudi Arabia. But most people don't think of Senegal and 12 million Sufis, 96% of the population belonging to a Sufi tariqa, for example. They might not think of Bengali as probably being the largest first language spoken by Muslims around the world, much more than Arabic and Farsi and Urdu. And so I think when we think about thinking about the Muslim world in different sorts of ways, it's important to also recognize there's different ways to conceptualize and think about the Muslim world. And I think in the same way that space enlivens the Muslim world, space also can't be the only way in which we anchor our Muslim identities. And so I think the example you brought of Omar ibn Said is a great example. in the United States, we have Atlanta, we have the Gullah Islands, for example, in which we know there is some relationship to some of the earliest Muslims migrating. But there isn't, again, a memory within even the Gullah people of that Muslimness. But it comes in terms of food pathways and in terms of other sorts of dances and things like that that may have been associated with the larger cultural identity of being Muslim. And so oftentimes when religion isn't visible, culture is visible in interesting ways. And then it's up to people to try and piece these things together. But I think that, when we talk about the past, I think it's also at this sort of junction to maybe it's a great opportunity to also think about then what the future may look like. We're now looking at several generations in North America of Muslims. You now have Muslims, multi-generational Muslims born in the United States who only know Islam in the North American context. And I think of, Zaytuna College, for example, in the United States, and the founders of that college who were born in the United States, many of them converts to Islam, educated interestingly abroad, ironically again in West Africa, mostly in Mauritania, and then coming back to the United States and finding a space. In Toronto, you have the Revival of the Islamic Spirit conference happening every year, which is a very inclusive space for gender particularly, and has found a place for youth culture to thrive and develop. And so I think there are spaces, not in the traditional sense, being created in the North American context that allow for groups who I, of course, identify as Muslim, but who may not have been able to find a sense of community to be able to sort of search for that sense of community in diverse ways.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rizwan. And so, as we talk about this concept of fluidity and change in religion, right, and reflecting back to the title of this talk, A Living Faith, could you talk a little bit more about different ways where you've seen religion or religious practices change and evolve over time? And then also, to contrast that, what happens if those practices become fossilized?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think also it's interesting because I think we're at I think globally this is true, but I think also in the context of, let's say, Canada or the United States, I think religion, the broad idea of religion, people have hesitancy about. I spend a lot of my time with young people at university, and we always talk about the fact that they don't like to admit that they're religious to their friends, you know what I mean? Because it's not a cool thing to do, right? And maybe there's a particular connotation with saying that you're religious, and it doesn't matter what, if you say you're Christian or you're Muslim or you're Hindu or whatever. And so I think it's cool to have cultural difference. I think we're at an era right now where cultural difference is like a fad, and we love to be different and have our cultural foods and our attires, but religion still has this kind of ambiguous kind of perception for some people, right? And so one of the things I'm noticing, and I don't know, Rizwan, if you're finding this in your research as well, is that there's really this gravitation towards, and there's a long history for this and we don't have time to get into it, but spiritual is cool, or private practice is awesome. You know what I mean? I want to do yoga, I want to do this thing. And these are all things. I like to read Rumi poetry, and that makes me spiritual, but I don't buy into the religious stuff. And so we've obviously fissured or broken apart the fact that religion constitutes something that's institutional, maybe a little bit more strict, but spirituality is a little bit, hey, I made choices and I had the right to do that. And it's really individuated, and that gives you a sense of agency and that you're not just following a bunch of people, right? So I think that's interesting. I think that's problematic. All of that stuff we could get into. So I think that kind of landscape that we're operating in, and my generation is a part of that. I don't know if my parents' generation definitely weren't as immigrants, right? So I think each subsequent generation has arrived at this place in really, really interesting ways. And so I think the fossilization tendency we might hear from first gen folks who come in and then really have to hold on to their religion because they hadn't, that's the thing that they wanted to continue, right? We have a tendency to really hold on to things, especially when we're in new situations and we're trying to survive, right? And that's completely from a social sense makes, great sense, and it's practical. Religion is the thing that builds community. It's the thing that helped you get your, kids, situated and all that stuff. The second gen folks, the 1.5ers like me, you might be oh, I don't want to do the thing my parents did. I want to do something different, right? I want to figure out my own path. I want to take these courses in university, right? And so this is where it's really tricky. And that is colliding with the sense that we really have individualized, we value individual spirituality, right? We want community and we want belonging and we want greater meaning, but we don't think that we want it from religion anymore because religion is such a bad thing. right? And so this, I think, has really created difference across how different generations, like parents, grandparents, young people, are perhaps experiencing and tapping into a shared religion, within families. Our encounter with different people with different religious traditions are also forcing us to be like, oh, what is it that I believe? And perhaps people, as Rizwan, you're saying, are converting to traditions, opting into different practices, converting into a tradition because of marriage, because of these things, right? And so there's like some of those practical dimensions. And I think there's also a value, just the way, because of capitalism, just the way that society is kind of oriented itself now at this current moment, where it's like far better for us to pick and choose and be individualistic about our practices, and perhaps not be really tied to like the strict rules of a practice. So that's kind of my sense of like talking to young people. Rizwan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think at least for a generation, there's been a dichotomy or a separation created between religious and spiritual. And I know for many people, spiritual, I think you defined it really, really well, is this kind of, I can practice on my own terms. So whether that means taking things from different things that are meaningful for me, or taking things from my own tradition that I can do in my own way. And I think many people feel sometimes the formulas, or the formulas of religion in this sort of a strict sense, are somehow, if not oppressive, they don't allow that sense of individual freedom. We oftentimes inherit religion, we inherit tradition, which doesn't oftentimes leave space in many religious traditions for finding ways to express ourselves. Like you described it really, really well in terms of not being able to find our agency. And so I think spiritual is oftentimes thought of in contrast to religion. And as we know, that's problematic in lots of sorts of different ways, but it's a way that this particular generation is redefining that sense of being involved in the religious life, but on their own terms. And Rumi you're working on Rumi, better than myself, but Rumi is a great example. And I know in the Ismaili community over the last generation, Sufi poets like Rumi are oftentimes anchored upon, because they're seen sometimes as kind of anti-formulaic, antinomian, anti-space. It's about individual practice, interior practice. And so things like that, are each generation negotiates their own sort of space. And I think, to give another example from another time about how different communities have thought about space, or thought about how things change, I can think of an example in the Ismaili community, where when some of the first migrants from South Asia, from the Indian subcontinent to East Africa came and brought their faith in, they brought some of the institutions with them. So, a Jamaat Khana, for example, was established in Zanzibar in 1838. And this was sort of modeled on, of course, a sense of what was happening in South Asia at the time. Now, what's interesting is that in the period shortly after 1838, the first Aga Khan arrives in India, in the subcontinent, and there are a number of ritual changes that take place because he is now in contact with the community. Now, what's interestingly is East Africa is still somewhat geographically divorced from the subcontinent, and so they maintain older traditions. And so when you have Ismailis from East Africa and South Asia coming into contact in the early period of the 20th century, they're noticing different rituals amongst themselves, because one has kind of captured and preserved the rituals of the imagined land, but that in the imagined land that they're preserving, those have already changed. And so there's really, really interesting interactions that are taking place. Both are valid ways of practicing faith, but they're different because of the forces that have been at play in the same community, but in different geographic spaces. And the same we see true of culture all the time. The adhan, which is, the call to prayer, which is recited in many masjids vocally, I see in different places translated in different ways. So in parts of Gujarat in India, you have the nagara that's played, the drum. In China, you have the bidug, which is in Indonesia, you have the bidug in Java, which is again another kind of drum. In places in Syria and in other places that I've seen, the call to prayer is actually a chorus. It's 5 or 7 people reciting it. And so culture oftentimes influences the ways in which these practices, which we see as essential, express themselves in different environments. In certain places, you have to wear certain kinds of clothes to go into the mosque that are considered appropriate. And so over time, culture changes things, geography, time, of course, changes things as well. And as Shobhana said, this is a whole different topic for a whole another critical conversation. But the important thing is that there is this fluidity, that rigidity is not necessarily a feature or principle of religious practice. And there have been these changes over time. Who gets to negotiate these changes? Who authorize these changes? That's a whole different topic and a whole different sort of thing that takes place. But I think it's important to recognize that there is this sense of dynamism that can exist within religious communities and within religious practices and religious spaces.
And I think this links with a question that's in the Q&A from Rosina Fabani. And there's this, as if I'm interpreting the question correctly, there's this kind of question about this difference between what is religion and what's culture. And I think, Rizwan, you're also kind of like playing with that idea. And like the hard thing is that it's so hard to say, like, where does culture begin and religion end, or vice versa. And from what I understand of the question, that perhaps your child has a presentation to do on cultural food. And, like what constitutes cultural food or religious food or things like that. And I have more and more students in my classes who, I teach an Intro to Islam class, for instance, this semester. I have students who say, I'm a cultural Muslim, I'm not a religious Muslim, and I'm here in this class to learn about my religion. And I'm just like, oh. And so I'm finding that a lot of young folks, at least folks who are 20 years old, the students I teach, who are like intentionally identifying as cultural. And I often ask them, like, why do you say you're a cultural Muslim? Because I'm just curious, I want to know what that means. And then they will say, well, I don't practice any of the things, but I know of, like, it's at home, right? And so they're defining that as a cultural thing as opposed to them being really quite religious. And others will say, no, I do practice, right? So I think even with Islam, it's a comparable that and it's not the same because I think there's so much differences. And so maybe this is not the right analogy to make, but you have many people in the Jewish community who would identify saying, I'm a cultural Jew, but I'm not like a religious Jew. I'm a secular Jew, right? And so I think I'm seeing similar tendencies among Muslim students who are really saying, well, they're a secular Muslim, but culturally they're, and for them, culture could be, Pakistani, it could be Indonesian, you know what I mean? It's so many different things. And this is where it gets really complicated, because I think, Rizwan, you and I have like traveled and we realize, but Islam in Egypt looks really, really different from like some of the things I'm noticing in Islam in Sri Lanka or in India or in Indonesia, right? And so even when we start talking about culture, it's like, well, which, there's so many cultures. We're talking about a population of, over 1 billion people of Muslims around the world who all over the world, right? And then American Muslims now, right? And so I sometimes get Muslim students who are converts. And so they would identify as being racially white. And they would say, oh, I often feel like I don't have the cultural capital to be a Muslim sometimes. And I feel, really sad about that. I'm like, well, no, you do your thing, right? And then so I think they're struggling to figure out how they could tap into this community that they've made a decision to tap into out of their own choice to be religious. And so I think, Rosina, this is a great question. And I actually think about it a lot, and I unfortunately don't have an answer. But I think this idea, what is culture, what is religion, where does one begin, where does the other end, and what is its relationship? How do we think about Islam? Is as being Muslim cultural, as being Muslim religious? I think yes, no, maybe all of the above kind of thing, right? Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know we're getting close to the end of this conversation. But before we do have several more questions from the audience that we'd love to get to. But any, Rizwan, Shobhana, any final concluding thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share with the audience before we jump into more of the Q&A?
There's lots of thoughts, but I also want to leave questions for the Q&A as well. Just quickly to piggyback on Shobhana's thoughts about culture, I always flip back and forth, because I think culture can be an envelope for religion, in the sense of it providing sort of an overarching framework by which religion can express itself. But in the convert situation, oftentimes people choose to be more outwardly expressive about their religion in attempts to try and show their Muslimness. And so in that way, religion is sometimes seen as an envelope to culture. And so religion becomes the way in which culture expresses itself. And so I think different people negotiate the idea of culture and the idea of religion in certain ways. I think the challenge has been is that over history, many groups that tend to have been given power or have acquired power to define what Islam is, tend to think about Islam as cultureless, that Islam is expressed through these particular forms in these particular ways through these particular institutions, and culture has no play. And so oftentimes culture is seen as somehow being associated with innovation, or being associated with something that sullies or dampens religion or religious practice in a way that somehow makes it less pure. And I think that's the challenge, because I think all of us know from our own experiences that that's not the case, that religion moves, it transforms. We see it in different forms as we travel to different places, or as we express ourselves over, it expresses itself over time. The pandemic is a great example. Things that would never have been possible in a non-pandemic world became possible in the masjid, became possible in the Jamaat Khana, which would once have been sort of seen as being innovation or being included as something that was outside of the religious domain. And so I think, one of the things that I've learned over time, and I've learned from my research, is that oftentimes it's not theology or defining religion that changes in itself. It's circumstance that requires theology to transform and move. And COVID, the pandemic, is a great example about how something of that nature, in this case in a global nature, impacted things. We have Muslims in parts of the world, Central Asia and Africa, who are still nomadic. You don't have the opportunity to build space. And so they've negotiated a space for them, a place for themselves to be able to practice, because they don't want to be not included within the sense of the Ummah. They want to be part of this global community. And so I think it's important to think about these things in complex ways and not essentialize or sort of tie ourselves down. And I think when we have examples like this, like the pandemic, or think about technology, or think about things in interesting ways, it allows us to deepen our sense of what religion may mean to us and in our lives.
I think one of the things I often tell my students is that, like, what if we started the story of Islam from the Ismaili tradition or Sufi tradition or Shia tradition, instead of suggesting there's a normativity or chronology that we have to follow? And then how does that kind of really help us bend boundaries? And because I think fundamentally for me, the work that I do as a scholar is really to bend boundaries. I don't really like being, telling students to compartmentalize and box things in, but rather to be open to diversity. And a lot of my students really struggle with it, because they're like, no, we want just give us a short answer. Dr. Xavier, stop rambling. Just give us a short answer, yes or no. And I'm like, no, maybe, but. And so I do a lot of this in class, and they get really annoyed with me. And of course I have to try to tell them no, this idea that we could, as Rizwan is saying, just give this one sentence and be done with it. Let's answer next question. And the fact that Rizwan and I could probably keep talking about some of these topics forever and provide all these, different qualifications and footnotes and be like, how about this and how about that? I think that that's the story you want to talk about, right? That's the diversity you want to introduce and say, in some ways, just, because of the diversity is still constituting a kind of a unifier, right? A lot of Sufis like to talk about, the diversity is actually a symbolism of the one. And so when we don't get scared of the diversity, but we actually lean into it and think of the diversity as a way to understand unity, then you get into this other playing field that's quite fun. And the Sufis are really great about this. Ismaili philosophy is really great about this. A lot of the traditions that we have are really, really great about this. But I think sometimes it's just easy for us as human beings to be like, no, I just want the easy answer, right? And I think that's where I find that my work and what that I do with the students is really important, is that I just don't want to give them the easy answer. And they'll be annoyed with me, but 10 years down the road, they'll write an email and say, thank you, right? Maybe not right now. And I think that's important, right? And I think that's maybe the one thing that I would want, that the folks who have gathered with us and are interested in these things and asking these really important questions that are really personal, is that to actually it's really complicated, it's really messy. And in fact, that messiness and the complexity and that diversity is really the essence of the thing that we're trying to talk about, right? If we want to essentialize anything, let's essentialize the diversity. If we want to essentialize anything, let's essentialize the messiness and the complexity. And I think that's what keeps Rizwan and I doing the work that we do. And we're so jazzed about it, because I think let's get people to understand and kind of swim in the waters with us around this stuff, right? Because that's, I think, this part, at least for me, a little bit more fun.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just going to end on, I think something that I like to tell all of you is, when I started doing my research, it was in the kind of pre-YouTube era when I first started, and there weren't kind of records of Muslim practices and rituals, and so I had to dig them out. And for me, I was entrusted in some cases for the first time with telling the stories of others. But I want to tell each of you to tell your own story. Find a way to express yourself, whether it's through art, through literature, through the work that you do, through the stories you share with other people, because it's those stories that will allow others to sort of see the diversity in a very humane and human form. And I think that's really, really important for us to, for Shobhana and I, for us to rescue the present, or even preserve the present to rescue the past, is a long process. it's not easy. And then to translate it and make sense for other people is also a challenging process sometimes. But when the voices are your own, it makes such a difference because you speak with an authenticity of experience that we as secondhand sort of storytellers can't do. And so tell your stories, find ways to express yourselves. I think that's one of the most important things you can do. And that collectivity of those stories is really going to give us a picture of what Islam looks like today.
Thank you all so much. And I think over the past hour we touched on so many different topics, and I feel like we got a lot of suggestions for probably 5 or 6 more critical conversations after this. So thank you all so much. As we talked about just diverse practices, some of the roles that community plays in faith practice and sacred space. But also, I think one of the things that really resonated with me is this concept of dynamism in the practice of faith, right? And Rizwan, like you were mentioning, it's figuring out our story, and then it's got me thinking a lot about what's my story, and how do I want to articulate that? And I'm sure a lot of our audience is also thinking about their own stories and their own journeys, and then how they want to articulate those. So with that, I just want to make a quick pivot to some of the Q&A questions that we got from the audience. So one of the questions that was asked was, what spaces can we create for the new generation that can be inclusive of their lives and the combination of some of the old and new cultures? So Rizwan or Shobhana, whoever wants to take that one.
I think like Rizwan's looking at.
I'm happy to go too, but I go ahead and start by all means.
This is a great question, and when I saw it, I was like, oh, like we have to answer this one, don't we? I think the asking of this question is wonderful, and I think that's the work. Like the generative of like asking questions, I think it's so generative and it's so important. And I think so much of this is like, talking to each other and being like, what are the needs amongst my immediate community, recognizing that your community, immediate people around you don't represent the entirety of every experience. But I think, as Rizwan is saying, is like talking to people, figuring what the needs are is so important. And so much of this will be different, right? Inclusion and the needs of particular people at particular times. It may be around caretaking responsibilities for people who are parents and need support with childcare. And so what does it mean to be welcoming of young children into a space, and not being like, oh, get that kid away from here because they're crying and we're trying to pray. Like, how is that deterring caretakers from wanting to be in a space and be part of a community? What does it mean in how we treat our elders, right? How we treat people access, right? Like actually being physically able to enter a space. Like, is the door wide enough? Does it allow for accessibility of people who have different hearing abilities, different speech experiences, right? So I think so much of what constitutes like the needs of an inclusive space are going to differ. And I think if you even ask, right, like sometimes when we organize events, we just should even be like, oh, who is our audience going to be, and how do we want to make sure that everybody feels welcome at that space, right? And I think it's just wonderful to ask. I think we have a sense of insecurity that we're outing ourselves by even asking the question, and to be like, oh, we don't know. No, we're not supposed to know, actually. And it's actually quite wonderful, from an organizational activist perspective, to be like, okay, well, what do you think people need, and how can we do the work to get that, right? With Zoom stuff, we were quite quick about getting transcription services going and all of this stuff going, and we're like really thinking about making sure that the materials that we're producing are accessible to everybody. And those are little things that we can do, and like we're going to make mistakes along the way, right? This is never going to be an actualized moment, but rather the striving and asking the question and consulting. I think I would center that as the practice, and then the actualization as an ongoing process. So I'm sorry, Sheila, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I don't have a direct answer, but I am like very grateful that you're asking the question.
And I would agree with Shobhana. I think, oftentimes the guardians of decision makers at spaces are the people who imagine their space to be homogeneous. And so oftentimes, or they're part of an older culture. And so, if your masjid committee or your Jamaat kind of sort of committee is, men of a particular race and generation, they're going to make decisions based on the lenses they use to see the world. And so I think volunteer, if you're sort of in charge of committees, get people with diverse voices on those committees, because I think when you begin to see their world through their eyes, you also realize that things that maybe have been blinders for you. So you may not have thought of, a space as being marginal to a particular group of people because you're not seeing it through their eyes. And so I think the more the greater the sort of range of eyes you can see a space through, or if you feel that the way you see a space is not reflected in the people that are making decisions about your space or the programs that are held, try and volunteer. I think that's the way that people can begin to sort of see your point of view as well. And, culture and practice changes slowly and it changes organically. And I know oftentimes we're in a rush to make change today or tomorrow. And I think we need to have some level of patience. And so that's, I know, the hardest thing for many in this generation is to find that sort of wherewithal to have that patience. But I think the more and more you can be part of the voice, you can then also be part of that solution and be inclusive as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rizwan. And yeah, I mean, I think one thing that really resonates with me is what you said about how long change is slow, right? And it's just not something that happens overnight. And it's something I think I struggle with at times too, in this world that we live in of instant gratification and instant change. But it's definitely, thank you for that reminder. The other question that we also had in the chat, amongst many other questions, was how important is congregation to deriving value from performance of rituals in a sacred space?
I can start with this, Shobhana, if you're okay with that. Spaces have always been places of individual piety and collective piety. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I think, when we see kind of visuals of practice, or when we think of practice, we're oftentimes thinking of this collective zikr, or coming together to recite a dua, or coming together to recite the salah or the namaz. And I think it's also important, I think, for us to realize that in many Muslim countries, the mosque isn't just open at certain times around prayer times. Or a shrine isn't just open, it's open all day. And oftentimes people can come when they want to seek comfort, to seek solace, to seek spaces, because oftentimes in congregation, while congregation provides that sense of community, it provides that sense of sort of collectivity in prayer, it may not necessarily provide the reflective individual space that you might need. And, we tend to think of collective prayers. One of the ways I like to think of collective prayers is sometimes as inherited prayers, things that kind of bind us together. But individual prayers can also be sort of things that we inherit, but also things that we do on our own. And so if you don't want to talk to Allah in Arabic, there's no need, you don't have to. You can talk to him in English or French or Spanish or whatever language, or Farsi or whatever language you want to. And so I think the role of the individual prayer we sometimes neglect or relegate to the home, but I don't think we should. I think there's oftentimes that providing that sort of atmosphere of the sacred in that space also has value. And sometimes that quietude, that solace allows a kind of intimacy with the divine that we may not necessarily feel in the home, or we may get in the context of collective prayer, which is kind of more formulaic. And so the collectivity, I think, is interesting, is important for our larger sense of identity, for our larger sense of practice, for being able to come in congregation and the value that brings. But I don't think we should neglect or ignore the individual as well. And I think that's something that's really, really important. And I think, again, the pandemic highlighted some of that we may not have access to the space necessarily, but we still had access to that individual sense of prayer, and that has value, I think, in our lives as well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have anything else to add.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I know we're actually a little bit over our time, but just in conclusion, I wanted to take a moment to thank you, Shobhana, Rizwan, for your time, your insights, and just kind of the transparency you provided in sharing your thoughts and views on this topic. And also want to thank the audience for taking the time. I hope this was just a start of a critical conversation, of many critical conversations I think that we can have amongst ourselves, within our communities, within our peer groups, and hopefully today was just a catalyst to have more and more of these conversations. And I just hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed being part of this journey. And just a few announcements before we go. In the chat, you will find some resources that were recommended by the speaker. Those would be good if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about some of these different topics. And for the recording of this conversation, as well as past critical conversations that we've had, you can find them on the ITREB USA under the Facets of Faith page. And I believe a link to that is also in the chat. And, please look out for more information on this Smiley USA webpage, as well as social media pages for other young adult conversations. I know we have one later today, actually, as well as just other, future critical conversations like this one. And lastly, please take the survey at the end of the session. Will pop up on your screen just as you leave. That your candid feedback is just very helpful in helping the team shape this and future conversations, and really try to cater this to more and more needs of all of you. So thank you again, and Yali Madad.